Daddy, she's there again, Annie Whitmore whispered into the phone as she stood beside the old oak tree near the side of the playground at St. Catherine's Academy. Her small fingers tightened around the phone while her eyes stayed fixed beyond the iron fence. "She's been watching me," Annie said softly. "Today makes 3 days." On the other end of the line, Jonathan Whitmore went silent for half a breath. "The same woman?" he asked. "Yes, Daddy, the same one. Same coat, same scarf. And she's holding that pink doll again." Jonathan's voice lowered at once, calm but sharp. "Tell me exactly where you are." "By the oak tree, near the side wall." "Good. Stay there. Don't go toward the fence. Don't speak to her. I'm coming." Around Annie, the school morning looked perfectly ordinary. Children in navy sweaters crossed the blacktop in little groups. Teachers called instructions over the noise. A crossing guard lifted a hand to stop a late-arriving SUV. Somewhere nearby, someone had brought a blueberry muffin for breakfast, and the sweet smell still floated in the air. Everything looked safe, except for the woman beyond the fence. She stood on the public sidewalk in a brown coat, a faded scarf tied over her hair, and an old pink cloth doll pressed tightly against her chest. She did not wave. She did not smile. She only looked at Annie with a kind of intensity that made the bright morning feel strangely thin. "Is she still looking at you?" Jonathan asked. "Yes." Before Annie could say more, a voice sounded behind her. "Annie, sweetheart, what are you doing over here?" Annie turned quickly. It was Mrs. Palmer, her homeroom teacher, a woman in her 50s with warm brown curls and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She took one look at Annie's face, then at the phone in her hand. "Are you all right, honey?" "I'm talking to my daddy." Jonathan heard the voice through the phone. "Who's with you?" "Mrs. Palmer." "Put her on, please." Mrs. Palmer took the phone with polite confusion. "Hello, this is Margaret Palmer." "Mrs. Palmer, this is Jonathan Whitmore. My daughter says the woman outside the fence is back. Can you confirm that someone is standing there now?" Mrs. Palmer turned toward the fence, following Annie's line of sight. Annie watched her expression change. First, simple attention, then recognition, then something heavier. "Yes," Mrs. Palmer said quietly. "She's there." "The same woman from the last 2 mornings?" Jonathan asked. Mrs. Palmer hesitated. "I believe so." For a moment, silence hung on the line. Then Jonathan said very evenly, "She has been there for 3 days watching my daughter, and no one informed me?" Mrs. Palmer's face tightened with regret. "I'm sorry. She never approached the gate. She never caused a disturbance. I assumed she might be someone connected to pickup." "You assumed wrong," Jonathan said. His voice never rose, which made it land harder. "I'm on my way. Keep Annie inside, away from the front perimeter, and do not let that woman speak to her." "Of course." Mrs. Palmer handed the phone back to Annie. "Daddy," Annie whispered, "am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Jonathan said at once. "You did exactly the right thing. Go inside with your teacher. I'll be there in minutes." Annie nodded and followed Mrs. Palmer toward the building. But before she went in, she looked back one last time. The woman had not moved. She still held the doll tightly, as if it were the most important thing she owned. And now that Annie looked a little longer, she saw something else. The woman's eyes were wet. "She doesn't look bad," Annie murmured before she could stop herself. Jonathan heard it. "What do you mean?" Annie searched for the words. "She just doesn't look like she wants to hurt me." That answer seemed to affect him more deeply than fear would have. "Go inside, Annie," he said quietly. "I'm coming." By the time Jonathan Whitmore left his office tower, 3 members of his security team were already waiting near the car. Graham Ellis, his head of security, opened the rear door as Jonathan approached. "She's inside the building now," Graham said. "Teacher escorted her in. We've got 2 men headed to the school and another unit coming from the Upper East Side." "I want the perimeter covered before I arrive," Jonathan said, getting into the back seat. "Not after." "It will be." The car pulled away from Whitmore Tower with practiced speed. Jonathan sat back, phone still warm in his hand from Annie's call. He looked out at the passing traffic, but his mind was nowhere near the street. All he could see was his 6-year-old daughter hiding behind a tree, trying to sound brave because she trusted him to know what bravery required. 3 days. That was what unsettled him most. Not just that a stranger had appeared, but that she had returned. A person who came back to the same fence at the same school to watch the same child was no casual concern. He called the headmistress before the car had cleared the next block. "St. Catherine's Academy, Evelyn Porter speaking." "Mrs. Porter, this is Jonathan Whitmore. Annie is safe?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. She's in my office with Mrs. Palmer." "I'll be there shortly." "Walk me through your precautions." A slight pause. He disliked pauses like that. "We've kept her inside the administrative wing," Porter said. "Front desk staff are watching the entrance, and one of the groundsmen has gone to check the sidewalk." "One groundsman," Jonathan repeated. "Until your security team arrives." "A woman has watched my daughter for 3 consecutive days," he said. "This is not the time for minimum effort. I want every camera feed from the front and side perimeter preserved. I want Mrs. Palmer ready to speak to me. And I want no contact between Annie and anyone outside your staff until I arrive." "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." When the car finally turned onto the avenue leading to St. Catherine's, 2 black SUVs were already at the curb. One security man stood near the entrance, another at the corner, both alert without being obvious. Jonathan got out before the driver could open the door. "She's still here?" he asked. Malik, Graham's deputy, stepped toward him. "No visual now. She was gone by the time we got here. We're pulling exterior footage." Jonathan didn't waste time answering. He was already moving. Inside, the school smelled of lemon polish, crayons, and old books. Headmistress Porter waited outside her office, hands folded too tightly at her waist. "Mr. Whitmore." "Later," he said. "My daughter." Porter opened the office door. Annie sat beside Mrs. Palmer in a chair too large for her, a cup of apple juice untouched on the table beside her. The moment she saw him, her shoulders softened. She didn't run to him. Annie was not that kind of child in public. Instead, she stood and waited. Jonathan crossed the room, knelt in front of her, and looked her over carefully. "You all right?" "Yes, Daddy." He touched her arm once, then rose and looked toward the adults in the room. "Tell me everything." Mrs. Palmer admitted it first. She had noticed the woman the previous 2 mornings, but had assumed she might be connected to Annie's family. She had never approached the gate, never caused a disturbance, never tried to enter the school. "You thought," Jonathan said. "Yes," Mrs. Palmer replied, eyes lowered. "Procedure can be reviewed later," Jonathan said to Porter. "Facts cannot." He turned back to Annie. "Show me where she stood." Annie walked to the window and pointed beyond the oak tree to the fence line. "There," she said,
Same place as yesterday, and the day before. Jonathan followed the line of her small hand toward the empty stretch of sidewalk. Something cold moved through him. Not yet recognition, but not far from it. He sat down beside Annie rather than across from her.
"Start from this morning," he said gently. "Tell me only what happened today." Annie folded her hands in her lap. "She was already there when our class went outside." "Same clothes?" "Yes." "Same doll?" "Yes." "Did she speak to you?" "No." "Did she speak to anyone else?" "No." "Did she look away from you?" Annie thought carefully. "Only once, maybe, when some kids ran in front of me, but then she looked back." Jonathan nodded. "I want you to answer this carefully. Did she look at you the way a stranger looks at a child?" Annie frowned. She took questions seriously. "No," she said at last. "How then?" "Like—" Annie's brows drew together. "Like she was trying to remember something, or like she already knew it." The room went very still. Jonathan held himself perfectly still as well, though inside something had shifted. Annie's next words landed even harder. "It felt personal," she said. A knock came at the door, and Graham entered carrying a tablet. "We pulled the exterior footage," he said. Jonathan stood. "Show me." The image was grainy, black and white, and imperfect, but clear enough. Children crossing the yard, a grounds cart rolling by, wind moving the hedges. Then the woman appeared by the fence nearest the oak tree. Brown coat, scarf, doll. "She arrived just after recess began," Graham said. "Same time pattern for all 3 days. Same location." Jonathan watched the stillness in her body. Not the restless alertness of someone stalking, not the distracted posture of someone waiting for pickup. She stood with a strange, pained purpose, and when Annie appeared in frame, there was no doubt at all who she had come to see. "She's looking only for Annie," he said. Mrs. Palmer swallowed. "That's what I saw." Jonathan turned to Annie again. "You did well," he told her. Annie looked up at him. "Is she in trouble?" "I don't know enough yet to say that." "She didn't yell at anybody," Annie said. "She just kept looking at me." "That may matter," Jonathan replied. After a pause, Annie added quietly, "When I looked at her, it felt like she knew me before I knew her." Jonathan didn't let his expression change, but the sentence struck something deeper than he wanted anyone to see. He turned to Graham. "I want every available frame cleaned up. Pull street cameras, neighboring storefronts, transit angles, whatever you can get. I want to know where she came from and where she went." Graham nodded. "You think this is personal?" Jonathan looked once more at the frozen image of the woman holding the worn doll against her coat. "Yes," he said. He did not take Annie home immediately. That surprised everyone except Annie, who knew her father's stillness always meant he was thinking 3 moves ahead. Instead, he had her settled in a smaller conference room beside Porter's office with crackers and fresh juice while he stepped outside with Graham. They had a better image now, pulled from a pharmacy camera across the block. The woman's face was lean and tired. Her coat was worn but clean. The scarf had likely once been floral. The doll in her arms was old, carefully mended, and unmistakably cherished. "She walked 2 blocks south," Graham said, "boarded a bus, got off in Midtown East. then disappeared into foot traffic near a shelter corridor. Jonathan said nothing for a moment. Then his phone rang. Daniel Reeves. Jonathan answered at once. Daniel had been his attorney for years and was one of the very few people trusted with the legal details of Annie's adoption. "Daniel," Jonathan said, "I need the sealed adoption file pulled immediately." There was a pause, but not a confused one, a knowing one. "Has something happened?" "A woman has been watching Annie at school." "Do you have a name?" "Not yet, but I want every document related to the transfer, including the private memorandum you told me you destroyed." Daniel exhaled. "I kept copies." "I assumed you did." Another pause. "If you're asking for those records now," Daniel said carefully, "then you already suspect this may involve Annie's biological mother." Jonathan's eyes went back to the image on the screen. Something about the woman's face had already unsettled him in a place logic had not yet reached. "I want facts," he said. "You'll have them within the hour." When Jonathan finally took Annie home, she rode quietly beside him in the back seat. She looked out the window for most of the drive, then said in a voice so soft he nearly missed it, "She looked lonely." Jonathan turned his head toward her. "Lonely people can still bring trouble with them," he said. "I know," Annie replied. Whitmore Estate rose from its lawns the way wealth often tried to rise from history, clean, permanent, and untroubled. Red brick, white columns, black shutters, long gravel drive. To most people, it looked like safety had been made into architecture. To Annie, it smelled like polished wood, lemon oil, and Miss Helen's kitchen. The front doors opened before the car fully stopped. Helen Brooks stood in the entrance hall in a pale blue blouse, silver hair pinned back, reading glasses on a chain. She had spent decades running large households and carried herself with the calm authority of a woman who considered most emergencies less important than a child coming home unsettled before lunch. "There's my girl," Helen said warmly. She did not ask questions at once. She kissed the top of Annie's head, took her school bag, and asked, "Tomato soup or grilled cheese first?" "Both?" Annie asked. Helen's mouth twitched. "Your judgment remains excellent." Jonathan gave Graham quiet instructions in the foyer. 2 men at the gate, one at the east lawn, one at the rear drive. Discreet rotations. No visible alarm. Then he went to his study. Daniel's email had already arrived. Jonathan opened the memorandum and read. Marissa Cole, 28 at time of intake. No fixed income. Temporary shelter history. Prior domestic violence report not pursued. Child approximately 12 months old. Transfer voluntary, under emotional distress and severe financial hardship. Jonathan kept reading until one line stopped him cold. When Marissa brought the child in, the child was carrying a pink cloth doll. He sat back slowly. The doll. Of course. A memory, long sealed, began to rise. Rain on stone. A frightened woman in a hallway. A baby in unfamiliar arms. The smell of wet wool. The sound of wind against glass. 6 years earlier, on a hard autumn night, Jonathan had returned to Whitmore Estate, exhausted from a day in Manhattan. Helen had met him in the entrance hall with an expression he had never forgotten. "There's a woman here," she had said. "She has a baby." At first, he had assumed it was another case connected to one of the family foundations. Medical bills, emergency housing, charity requests, the kind that crossed his desk all the time. But Helen had said, "She asked for you by name, and she will not leave the child with anyone else." He had found the young woman standing by the fire in a side sitting room, rain darkening the shoulders of her coat, a bruise fading near her jaw. She was thinner then, though not by much. Exhaustion had sharpened every line of her face. In her arms was a baby girl clutching a faded pink cloth doll. That baby had been Annie. Not Annie yet under the law. Not Annie Whitmore. But Annie all the same. The young woman had not wasted time with speeches. "They told me you help people," she had said. "Not like this," Jonathan had answered. "I know," she replied, "but she may not have tomorrow." That sentence had changed everything. The baby had been too quiet. Not neglected exactly, but tired in the way children become when instability has become the climate of their lives. Jonathan had asked the obvious questions. Where was the father? Why bring the child here? What exactly was she asking? Marissa had answered each one with the raw clarity of someone who had run out of performance. "He's gone when he's kind, and dangerous when he's not. Because you can do what I can't." And finally, in a voice that broke only at the edges, "I'm asking you to let her live the kind of life that doesn't eat children alive." Back in the present, Jonathan sat very still in his study. The memory now stood fully open before him. The woman at the school fence was no stranger. She was Marissa Cole, Annie's biological mother. Helen knocked lightly on the open study door and brought in coffee. "She's in the breakfast room," Helen said. "Eating, which is always hopeful." Jonathan looked up. "How is she?" Helen considered. "Trying to behave well because she thinks it helps the adults think clearly." That sounded exactly like Annie. Helen's gaze drifted toward the file on the desk. "Do you know who the woman is?" Jonathan did not answer immediately. "I may," he said at last. Helen absorbed that with calm. "May is not no." "No." She folded her hands. "Then you'll need to decide quickly whether Annie is better served by not knowing or by hearing part of the truth before she invents the rest." "She's 6. And 6-year-olds can smell hidden sorrow from down a hallway," Helen said. "You know that." Yes, he did. That was precisely the problem. A message buzzed from Graham. They had continued tracking Marissa quietly. She had gone to a low-income housing corridor near a shelter intake block. No hostile indicators. No attempt to approach the estate. No attempt to reach Annie directly. Jonathan sat alone with that information for a long time. Somewhere beyond the western lawn, Annie's life had always contained a story he had carefully kept behind a locked door. He had told himself that love, safety, and stability would make the beginning matter less. But now the beginning had returned and stood outside a school fence with a worn doll in its arms. The next morning, breakfast at Whitmore Estate tried to imitate normal. Oatmeal with brown sugar, strawberries, bacon broken into perfect little pieces the way Annie liked. Morning news murmuring from the small television under the cabinets. Dew on the lawn. A groundskeeper moving silently beyond the glass. But Annie knew at once that normal had only been borrowed. "Do I still have to go to school?" she asked. "Yes," Jonathan said. That surprised her. She had half expected to be kept home under Helen's watch while the adults sorted the danger out behind closed doors. "What if she's there again?" Annie asked. "Then this time," Jonathan said, "I'll know." There was more security near the school that morning, though not in a way designed to frighten children. A man in a gray coat by the gate, another near a lamppost with a coffee cup. Jonathan rode with Annie instead of arriving separately. When the car stopped, he got out first and opened her door himself. "You go in with Mrs. Palmer," he said. "No wandering." "I know." I'm aware that you know, he said. I'm saying it because I need to hear myself say it. That made Annie smile, briefly. Mrs. Palmer met them at the entrance, visibly more alert than the day before. Annie started toward the building, then looked back. Jonathan stood where she had left him, one hand in his coat pocket, eyes moving over the fence line, the sidewalk, the church corner, the parked cars. And then Annie saw her. Not by the front fence this time, but farther down the block beneath a sycamore tree. The same brown coat, the same scarf, the same pink doll. The woman was standing farther back now, as if she had understood that coming too close would close the distance forever. Annie stopped walking. Mrs. Palmer followed her gaze and drew in a breath. Jonathan turned instantly. He didn't perform alarm. He became stiller. "Inside," he said quietly. Mrs. Palmer guided Annie toward the doors, but Annie kept looking over her shoulder. The woman had not moved. She stood beneath the tree with the doll pressed to her chest and something raw in her posture, as if every part of her wanted to step forward while another part refused to let her. Once Annie was safely inside, Jonathan crossed the sidewalk. Graham appeared from nowhere and fell into step beside him. "Visual confirmed, same subject." "Stay back," Jonathan said. He did not hurry, and yet every part of him carried purpose. Marissa saw him coming before he reached her. Annie could see that even through the entrance glass. Jonathan stopped several feet away. Graham remained at a respectful distance. No one grabbed Marissa. No one shouted. The entire moment balanced itself on restraint. Jonathan spoke first. Up close, Marissa looked even more tired than frightening. Her coat had been mended near one cuff. Her shoes were clean but badly worn. Her face carried the thinness of someone who had spent years surrendering one thing after another. But her eyes were unchanged, wet, watchful, full of a grief too deep to be simple. "Marissa," Jonathan said. She flinched at the sound of her name. "You know who I am," she said softly. "Yes." "I didn't come to hurt her." "Then why did you come like this? Why the fence? Why silence? Why 3 days?" Marissa looked past him toward the school doors. "Because I needed to see her." "That does not answer the question." "It's the truest answer I have." Jonathan studied her. "You had no right to stand outside a child's school and watch her without identifying yourself." "I know." "Then why do it?" Marissa's voice broke, though only slightly. "Because grown people do foolish things when they're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of being too late." Jonathan said nothing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Marissa lifted the doll slightly, almost unconsciously. "She used to sleep with this," she whispered. That sentence struck him harder than accusation would have. "You remember that?" "Every day." Jonathan looked at the doll, then back at her. "You cannot do this through shadows, Marissa. If you are going to re-enter her life at all, it will not happen by haunting a fence line." Marissa lowered her eyes. "I didn't know if I had the right to come through the door." Jonathan stared at her. He could hear Annie's words in his mind. "She doesn't look bad. She looks sad. She looked like she knew me." Finally, he said, "You are going to come inside, and you are going to answer questions, truthfully. If you cannot do that, this ends here." Marissa looked up sharply, stunned. "You're letting me see her?" I am allowing a conversation, Jonathan said. Do not mistake that for trust. But when Annie was later brought to Porter's office and saw the woman from the fence sitting there with the doll folded carefully in her lap, crying without sound, she understood the most important thing in the room before anyone told her. The woman was not a stranger. Jonathan kept one hand on Annie's shoulder. Her name, he said carefully, is Marissa Cole. Annie looked from him to Marissa and back again. Do I know her? No one answered immediately. Finally, Jonathan said, Not in the way you mean. Marissa gripped the doll so tightly the cloth bent beneath her fingers. When she spoke, her voice was roughened by poverty, grief, and too many years of silence. I'm sorry, she whispered. Porter, sensing the collapse of school protocol, started to suggest taking Annie elsewhere. No, Jonathan said. The word was quiet but final. Then he crouched to Annie's level. There is something important you need to hear, he said. About her. Did she do something bad? Annie asked. Jonathan shook his head. No, not bad. Painful. Difficult. But not bad. Then Annie asked the question only a child would think to ask first. Why is she crying? Jonathan rose, turned partly away, and memory rushed fully back. The rain, the baby, the pink doll. Marissa standing in his house, asking for a future she could not give. When he spoke again, he kept his voice steady, because Annie needed steadiness more than softness. Years ago, he said, before you were old enough to remember, a woman came to my house on a very stormy night, carrying a little girl. The little girl was tired and hungry. She had a doll she loved very much. Annie's eyes moved slowly to the doll in Marissa's hands. Jonathan continued. That little girl was you. Silence followed. Not an empty silence, a shifting one. Marissa finally found her voice. I didn't come to hurt you, she said to Annie. I never would. Jonathan turned to her then, not with hatred, because hatred would have made things easier, but with the full weight of an old promise. Annie looked at Marissa, then at Jonathan. You knew her before me? Yes, he said. Were you there, Annie asked Marissa, when I was a baby? Marissa clutched the back of the chair to steady herself. Yes, she whispered. I was there. It was Annie who made the next step possible. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply looked at Marissa with grave seriousness and asked, Are you my first mama? Marissa's face trembled. Yes. The title did not break Jonathan. The gentleness with which Annie offered it nearly did. She looked at the doll again. Was that mine? Marissa nodded quickly. You used to sleep with it every night. I don't remember, Annie said. I know, Marissa whispered. Jonathan watched Annie carefully. She was still with them, still listening. So he gave her the rest she had earned. Marissa is the woman who gave birth to you, he said. Annie took that in with the solemn concentration she brought to everything important. Then she asked the question that had been standing behind all the others. If you loved me, why were you outside the fence instead of coming in? Marissa drew a breath that trembled on the way up. Because I didn't know if I had the right. Why not? Because the day I brought you to him, she said, nodding faintly toward Jonathan, I asked him to give you the kind of life I couldn't. Annie turned at once to Jonathan. You knew she was coming? Yes. For a long time? Yes. How long? Since you were 1 year old. That landed hardest of all. Later, back at the estate, Annie sat in Jonathan's study with a mug of hot chocolate cooling between her hands and the doll in her lap. If Marissa is my first mama, and you're my daddy, she said, then both things are true. Yes. That's strange. Yes. But not bad. No, Jonathan said. Not bad. Then she asked him the question he had known was coming from the moment he reopened the past. If she loved me that much, why did she leave me with you? Jonathan did not rush the answer. When a person has very little, he said at last, sometimes love is the one thing they have left that still knows how to think beyond itself. Annie frowned. I don't understand. No, he said softly. I don't expect you to. Not all at once. He leaned forward slightly. Some women leave because they stop loving. Others leave because they believe staying will destroy what they love. Those are not the same thing. Annie looked down at the doll. I think she was lonely for me. Jonathan felt something move through him that was too near grief to name. Yes, he said quietly. I think she was. Then she asked the next question. When you saw her at school today, did you already know it was her? He could have lied. He did not. Yes. Annie accepted the answer, though it hurt. Then why didn't you tell me before? Jonathan looked at his daughter for a long time. Because, he said, I wanted your life to begin where it became safe. But it didn't begin there. No. He folded his hands. When you were small, I made a choice. I told myself that if I loved you well enough, protected you carefully enough, and gave you a life with dignity and room to grow, then the beginning would matter less than what came after. I didn't hide that you were adopted. That would have been a lie. But I kept back the details because details become stories, and stories become identities before children are old enough to decide what belongs to them. Annie thought hard about that. So you were waiting? Yes. For what? For you to be old enough that the truth wouldn't feel like a hole opening under your feet. She looked down. It still feels a little like that. I know, he said. The next morning, Annie came downstairs with the doll tucked under one arm and a steadiness in her face that reminded everyone present that 6 years old was an inadequate description for certain children. At breakfast, she looked across the table at Jonathan and said, I still want to see her again. He had expected the sentence. What unsettled him was how calmly she said it. You've had less than a day to think about all of this, he replied. I know. I don't want more time before I see her. I want more time after. Helen, standing at the sideboard rearranging oranges that did not need rearranging, finally stepped in. If this is to happen, she said, it ought to happen somewhere no one feels cornered. By afternoon, a small city property owned by the Whitmore family had been prepared. Riverside House had a private garden room with French doors opening onto a brick terrace and climbing roses. It was neutral, quiet, and safe without being grand. Annie stood in the middle of the room, holding the doll, while Helen adjusted her collar for the third time. You are not required to be brave every second, Helen told her softly. What if she cries again? Annie asked. Then you may let her. Tears are not always an emergency. Jonathan, standing near the doors, turned slightly at that. They're information, Helen added. Then Graham appeared. She's here." The room went still. Marissa entered a moment later with Daniel Reeves behind her. She wore the same dark coat, though without the scarf this time. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked like someone who had tried very hard to arrive with dignity and was still uncertain whether the room would permit her to keep it. Her eyes found Annie immediately. This time, she did not cry. Annie noticed that at once. "Hello," Annie said first. Marissa swallowed. "Hello, Annie." Jonathan's posture eased by a single degree. Annie noticed that too. They sat in a loose circle by the windows, Annie on the settee with Helen beside her, Jonathan opposite in an armchair, Daniel slightly back. Marissa on the edge of a straight-backed chair, hands folded too tightly in her lap. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Annie broke the silence. "Your voice sounds different today." Marissa blinked. "Different how?" "Less broken." A small, unbelieving smile touched Marissa's face. "That's probably true." Annie studied her for another beat. "I wanted to know what you sounded like when you weren't crying." This time the tears rose in Marissa's eyes, but did not fall. "I'm glad you asked," she said. The room changed a little after that. Not healed, not easy, but changed. History was no longer standing outside a fence. It was sitting in a chair, answering questions in daylight. Annie touched the doll's skirt. "Did you fix the dress?" Marissa leaned forward slightly. "The hem? Yes, it tore when you were little. You used to drag her by one leg." "That sounds rude," Annie said. To everyone's surprise, a real laugh touched Marissa's voice. "It was." Annie smiled, small but real. Jonathan watched it happen with a kind of stunned humility. He had feared history would destroy calm if he let it speak. Instead, it became less dangerous the more ordinary detail it was allowed to contain. Then Annie asked the question that mattered most. "If you loved me, why did you leave me?" Marissa went very still. When she answered, she did not protect herself. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said. "I left because I loved you, and I was afraid the life around me was going to swallow you too." Annie listened without moving. Marissa's fingers twisted together. "I was living in one room over a laundromat by then. Before that, it was shelters, couches, church basements, whatever would hold us for a week or two. The man I had been with was dangerous, whether he was drunk or sober. There were nights I stayed awake holding you, because I was afraid that if I slept, trouble would reach us before I heard it. There were mornings I mixed water into milk because I didn't know if I could buy more by supper. There were days I walked until my feet bled because I thought one more office, one more shelter desk, one more person might look at me and decide you were worth saving." The room was silent, except for Annie's breathing. "Then I heard Jonathan Whitmore's name," Marissa continued. "A rich man, a man who helped children, a man whose mother funded shelters. Some people said men like that don't help women like me unless there's a reason. By then, I was past pride. I didn't need hope. I needed a door." Jonathan looked away toward the window, jaw set. Marissa kept going because Annie was listening and because truth, once begun, needed the dignity of completion. "I brought you to him because I had reached the place where love and terror looked the same. If I kept you with me, I thought I might lose you to hunger, violence, or one bad night that never ended. If I gave you up, I thought maybe you would grow up hating me. But alive seemed like the better bargain."
Annie's eyes filled, though she did not cry. Then she asked in the small, steady voice that undid everyone, "Did you want to keep me?" Marissa bent forward slightly, as if the question had struck her physically. "Every second," she whispered. "Every second." No one moved. Not Jonathan, not Helen, not Daniel, not even Graham near the doorway. Annie looked down at the doll, then back at Marissa. "Were you lonely without me?" Marissa gave a helpless little laugh through tears. "Yes." "All the time?" "Yes." "Even when you were busy?" "Especially then." Something changed in Annie's face. Not complete understanding, perhaps, but movement toward it. She slid off the settee and walked slowly across the room. Marissa went still again, not daring to move. Annie stopped beside her chair and held out the doll. "I think," Annie said carefully, "you should hold her for a minute too." That broke the room, though softly. Helen looked away. Daniel turned to the window.
Jonathan lowered his head, one hand across his mouth, overcome not by weakness, but by the force of seeing mercy arrive in a child's voice. Marissa took the doll in both hands as if receiving something sacred. Then Annie reached back without looking and found Jonathan's hand. He came to stand beside her at once. After a moment, Annie looked up at Marissa and asked, "Can somebody be your mother and still not be the one who raised you?" Marissa's face crumpled. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart." Then Annie did one more astonishing thing. With one hand, she held Jonathan's, and with the other, she touched Marissa's sleeve. For one trembling moment, the child stood between them, holding on to both. Later, when silence had softened into conversation, Annie looked from one adult to the other and said with complete seriousness, "That means I don't have to choose." Jonathan felt something inside his chest unclench. "No," he said, "you do not have to choose." Annie nodded, as though confirming a rule she intended to keep. "But there still have to be rules." That startled the faintest laugh out of Helen. Marissa wiped her face and nodded. "Yes, there do." Annie counted them as if she were settling a classroom disagreement. "No standing outside my school anymore." "No," Marissa said. "No more of that." "No sneaking." "No sneaking." Annie turned toward Jonathan. "And no more big truths waiting outside fences." This time, even he smiled. "That seems fair." The tension in the room eased enough for breathing. Daniel gently suggested that nothing had to be solved all at once. Annie said that sounded like adults getting tired before they got wise, which made Helen hide a smile behind her hand. Marissa, gathering herself, looked directly at Annie. "I don't want to rush into your life and make everything feel strange." "Everything already feels strange," Annie replied. The honesty of it made Marissa wince, but Annie went on in the same thoughtful tone. "What if I want to see you sometimes, but not every day?" "Then sometimes is what we do," Marissa answered. "What if I have questions later?" "Then I'll answer them if I can. And if I can't, I'll still tell the truth." Jonathan looked at her then, really looked. Hardship had worn her down, but truth, when it finally arrived, stood upright in her. Annie glanced toward Helen. "Can Miss Helen be there next time too?" "If you'd like me to be, darling," Helen said. "And Daddy?" Jonathan answered before she finished. Yes. That, in Annie's mind, seemed to settle the basic architecture of the future. Not certainty, not ease, but shape. When the meeting ended, it did so quietly. No dramatic farewell. No sudden embrace. Annie was tired. Helen saw it first. She said, "I think our girl has carried enough for one afternoon." Annie stood with the doll in her arms and looked at Marissa. "I'm glad you came in today," she said. Marissa pressed a hand to her mouth. "I'm glad too." "But next time," Annie added, "you can come through the door first." That brought tears to Marissa's eyes again, but she smiled through them. "Yes," she whispered, "through the door." On the drive back to the estate, Annie sat beside Jonathan with the doll in her lap and watched the city move by. After a while, she rested her head lightly against his arm. "I think the fence at school won't feel scary anymore," she said. "No?" She shook her head. "Not scary, just sad." Jonathan thought about that. Sad can change. Annie considered it and looked down at the doll again. "So can people." "Yes," he said quietly. "So can people." A week later, Annie returned to St. Catherine's on a clear spring morning. The iron fence still stood where it always had. The oak tree still cast its shade over the corner of the playground. Children still shrieked over hopscotch and jump ropes as if the world had never held anything more dangerous than scraped knees. But something had changed. Porter had changed school policy. Unknown adults outside the perimeter were now noticed and questioned. Teachers watched more carefully, and not only when the children of wealthy parents were involved. Mrs. Palmer had become gentler in a more attentive way, as if Annie's quiet certainty had taught her something about the cost of dismissal. Jonathan walked Annie to the steps. Before going inside, she looked once toward the fence line. Nothing was there now except sunlight on iron bars and wind in the lower branches of the oak. "She's not there," Annie said. "No. That's because now she knows how to come through the door." Jonathan knelt and straightened Annie's collar. "You all right?" Annie thought about it and answered with more honesty than comfort. "Not the same as before, but all right." He nodded. It was as much as anyone could ask. That Sunday, in a quiet city park lined with tulips and benches, Annie sat between Jonathan and Marissa for the first time in public. Not pressed tightly to one or the other, not performing reunion. Simply there, with the old pink doll in her lap and a paper cup of lemonade by her shoe. Marissa wore a navy sweater Helen had insisted she take. Jonathan, in shirt sleeves, looked less like a billionaire and more like a man learning how to loosen his hands around what he loved without dropping it. Children played farther down the path. An older couple fed crumbs to sparrows. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the hour. Annie took a sip of lemonade and looked ahead at the bright green of the park. "Miss Helen says some people are part of your life by promise," she said. Jonathan glanced at Marissa. "She does say things like that." "And some are part of your life by blood," Annie continued. Marissa's eyes went to the doll in Annie's lap. Annie leaned back with the calm certainty only a child can carry without arrogance. "I think that means I got lucky in a sad way." Neither adult answered at once. Neither trusted the steadiness of their own voice. Then Jonathan placed one hand over Annie's. After the smallest hesitation in the world, Marissa laid hers beside it. Nothing was perfect. Nothing was fully repaired. Poverty had still taken what it took. Years had still been lost. A child had still needed to ask questions no child should ever have to ask. But silence had ended. And sometimes, For people who have lived too long at the edge of loss, that is where healing begins.